The Boondokl Bedtime Stories by Dr. Robert Lefebvre. Number 19. When they got to the field opposite the church hall, where holy women were making tea, they saw a wonderful sight. Part of the field had been roped off for parking, and in the rest of the field there was an amazing number of stalls. There were all sorts of things that were being sold. Several grandmothers were really quite nervous. There were books and items of china and glass, and old knives and forks with ivory handles, and ink pots and glass medicine bottles, dolls and toys and games and all sorts of things. Then there were lots of knitted things that holy women had made when they weren't making tea. Then there were all the games, like in a circus fairground, with each one separated from its neighbours by bales of straw. There were coconut shies, in which there were large coconuts balanced on top of small hoops, the other way round from a circus fairground. Larger, but not much larger, hoops to be thrown over sticks in order to win prizes. Tails to be stuck onto cardboard donkeys when people were blindfolded. And, in pride of place, 2 sets of wooden stocks in which young men had been clamped. In the first one, the man was standing up and had his arms stuck in the stocks so that he couldn't get away. That wasn't really true, but it looked like it. People could pay money to throw buckets of water at him. In the other one, the man was sitting down on the ground, and people could pay money to throw small bags of flour at him. These games don't seem very kind, but they're part of the tradition of Old England, going back to days when these, and worse, were genuine punishments, often delivered through an unholy alliance between church and state. Then there was a steam engine, on which people could pay to have a ride, and there were 2 donkeys and a Shetland pony, which served the same purpose, a bouncy castle and a Punch and Judy glove puppet theatre. There are people nowadays who disapprove of Mr. Punch hitting his wife because they say that children shouldn't see these things, regardless of how often they see it at home in real life. They also disapprove of frightening young children when the crocodile comes and starts eating people, regardless of the dreadful things that children see on television and in video games. Political correctness goes crazy at times, if not always. The tug of war had to be cancelled because the health and safety people had said that there could be injuries and the church might get blamed. Yet another fine old English custom had disappeared in the new country that is fit only for lawyers. Then there were all sorts of animals in a mini farm. There were chickens and ducks and sheep and goats and pigs and a cow and an old cart horse. There were also rabbits and guinea pigs and hamsters that the young children could stroke and pat. And there were sheepdogs panting and looking around carefully to make sure that every animal was in its proper place. There were also dog obedience classes, so that people could show how obedient their dogs were, or not. At one point during the afternoon, the Venerable Charles Poodle had been surprised to come across Mrs. Arlette Black. "It's very kind of you to come to the church fete," said the Venerable Charles Poodle to Mrs. Arlette Black. "I didn't know you were a believer." "I'm not. I don't have any religious belief," replied Mrs. Black straightforwardly. "But I do believe in supporting the local community, and I do recognize that the church is an important social centre, in addition to being a beautiful building to which I'm glad to contribute towards preserving." "But wouldn't you like to contribute more to what happens inside it, rather than just to the roof on top of it?" asked the Venerable Charles Poodle. "No, thank you," said Mrs. Black politely. The Venerable Charles Poodle found Mrs. Arlette Black very difficult. He didn't understand how such an obviously nice lady could have such strange ideas. Nor did he understand how she could be so self-sufficient, perfectly happy to look after herself and be by herself, rather than be part of a community doing things with them and for them. "I do things for the community and for them when I feel like it, but not as an obligation," said Mrs. Black, as if reading his thoughts. "But that's so selfish, and you're not a selfish person." "I certainly am selfish. I'm totally selfish. I do what is in my own self-interest, regardless of what may be wished upon me or imposed upon me by church or state. It's in my selfish interest to be nice to people, and respectful of their differences, not to be nasty to them. I very much believe in the virtue of selfishness." The Venerable Charles Pootle found this all very, very difficult. He'd never met anyone like Mrs. Arlette Black in his entire life. She was disabled, but she didn't want help. She earned her own living, and she rejected her various entitlements from the government. She was kind and considerate, but had no religious belief. She valued money. She saw it as the means towards honest trade, rather than as the root of all evil. And, of all things, she was proud of being selfish, of believing that each individual was responsible to himself or herself, and should not wallow in blame and self-pity, expecting or demanding things from other people. She always makes sure that she herself is honest, reliable, and considerate in everything she does. Altogether, the Venerable Charles Pootle found Mrs. Black very confusing indeed. She ought to be a Christian, or a Muslim, or a Buddhist, or at least something, rather than an atheist with no religious belief at all. And she ought to be a socialist, parading her caring and sharing to everybody else, rather than a free market capitalist, believing in the social benefits of individualism and free trade. "Well," he said with the air of finality that only clergymen and politicians can produce, because they know when they've been defeated in an argument and don't know what else to say, "I suppose it takes all sorts to make a world." "Yes, it does," replied Mrs. Black, "and I respect all of them, whether they agree with me or not. Thank you for running the church fete. It's great fun, and I hope you raise a lot of money for the church roof." Mrs. Black didn't tell him how much she herself had contributed. She felt that this was none of his business. To be continued.